Greetings and welcome to the Words of Life, your more sure word of prophecy with Sean A. Mitchell. Well, we've been continually just plowing through Matthew chapter 5, making our way all the way up to Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, where Jesus began to talk about, those who would hear his sayings and put them into practice. He likened to a wise man who built his house on a rock. Then there was another man who also heard the sayings, yet he did not put the things that he heard into practice. And of course, they both dealt with the same type of different storms in their life. The first man was the man who survived. Unfortunately, the second man, he didn't have the same outcome. So let's continue to go back into Matthew chapter 5 and the Beatitudes. And we've just been going through all of these different things, talking about the different sayings of Jesus for successful living. Today, we kind of switch a little bit and we come to the end somewhat. And we've been kind of going through one little sentence at a time. Well, now we're actually going to look at a number of different verses. So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12 in the New King James Version. And it reads as following: Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I like that last sentence. They persecuted the prophets who were before you. Sometimes we can go through things and, we may make it seem like, well, we're the first person who's actually dealing with this, or we're the only person who's dealing with this. But people have dealt with these things before. None of us are the very first person who has had to deal with unfortunate things. But here, Jesus is telling the people that, blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So what does he mean by righteousness' sake? Well, let's just look in the Amplified as well, because the Amplified begins to amplify things. So it says this: blessed, comforted by inner peace and God's love are those who are persecuted for doing what is morally right. So for righteousness' sake is basically doing what is morally right, having morals, having values, having things that, you create as boundaries that you want to stay within. And so he's telling these particular people, blessed, comforted by the inner peace of God's love when you do the things that are correct. And there's a lot of different things that examples we could give, but I don't want to get really into all of that, because we know what is right. We know what is not right. But he tells them, blessed are you when you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Why would you be persecuted for righteousness' sake or doing what's right? Because, some people get to a point where you act like you're so perfect. You act like you never do anything wrong. And it's not that, it's just that this is the road that you have actually chosen. And unfortunately, you can get persecuted for that. Verse 11 goes on to say this, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evils against you falsely for my sake. Now here he's talking about for my sake, for Jesus's sake. Now you actually get persecuted. You get reviled against. So what does it say here in verse 11 in the Amplified? It says, blessed, morally courageous, and spiritually alive with life, joy, and God's goodness are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of your association with me. Well, he says in New King James Version, for my sake. Well, it says it in the Amplified, because of your association with me. Because of the association with Jesus, a lot of us are persecuted by that. Do you know that the term Christian actually came forth, not actually by God calling them Christians, not Jesus calling his own disciples Christians. That name actually gets its foundation out of a group of people who were really insulting the disciples and those who follow Jesus because of their association with him. That association was that because they follow him, they called them Christians. And in their view, Jesus was a man who actually had taken the worst type of punishment that it was in that day, and that was crucifixion. And so this wasn't Christianity. The term Christian in its core meaning was not a term of endearment. It wasn't even a term that they gave themselves. It was a term of people who actually persecuted him because of their association actually with Jesus. And so in the King James Version in verse 12, it tells us, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And so let's look at the Passion Translation. And just to sum this all up, it says, how enriched you are when persecuted for doing what's right. Again, we talked about that. For then you experience the realm of heaven's kingdom. So heaven comes down when you do right. Why? Because that is the culture of heaven. So now you get to experience heaven on earth, which is actually what the disciples were given as an answer when Jesus taught them how to pray. Then in verse 11 in the Passion Translation, it says, how blessed you are when people insult and persecute you and speak all kinds of cruel lies about you. And then I like this part, because of your love for me. And this is why I wanted to save this part. Because of your love for Jesus Christ, people will literally lie on you. That's what it says. It says, speak all kinds of cruel lies about you. And people begin to say things and do things that are so unrighteous just because of the simple fact that you love Jesus. Now, why is this happening? Well, first of all, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. And so really, in all honesty, most people, all people, basically, you could say for the most part, are influenced actually by a principality or powers. That's what the scripture tells us. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, rulers of darkness, wicked, evil and wickedness in high places, rather. This is what you're really dealing with. And so it is that wickedness that is influencing these people, really, in all honesty, to persecute the Christ in you because of the love for you. And so in verse 12 in the Passion Translation, it tells us, so leap for joy since your heavenly reward is great. For you are being rejected the same way the prophets were. And so our response should actually be leaping for joy and rejoicing, because our reward due to this persecution is simply the kingdom of heaven, which is our heavenly reward. Well, I hope that this has blessed you, touched you, even giving you some level of strength as you are dealing with different trials, tribulations, maybe that boss on your job or a coworker, whomever it may be, that you have an understanding. Look, heaven is your reward when you are persecuted. Heaven is your reward when people speak evil things and cruel things against you. And again, remember, this all happens for a number of different reasons: for your righteous sake, for the sake of Jesus, for the simple fact of being associated with Jesus, doing what's morally right, and just simply because you love Jesus. That's why these things happen. Please visit my website, www.sam-ministries.org, and go ahead and click on subscribe for the daily devotional, The Words of Life, Your More Sure Word of Prophecy. And also subscribe to my podcast, The Creation of a New Humanity, where we are designing and building the new race, the Christ race, one man, one woman, one marriage, one family at a time. Tune in tomorrow for Your More Sure Words of Prophecy with Sean A. Mitchell.